Hello, oops, wrong window for that. Okay. Let's fix that up. There we go, that's better. Oh, morning all. Bit knackered. Weekend away gaming, getting a bit old for this going away and sleeping on couches and guest beds thing. But there you go. Housekeeping. Anything to go over? No, ran my first Cyberpunk session of the new campaign. That went pretty well. Anything else? Not a lot. I'll be working on various things. Getting back in the swing of things this week. Commissioned some of the art for the Zellart Scholarship. The first parts of that just come in. Yeah, not a lot else. Sorry, light's too bright. There you go, much better. Right, the news. Let's knock this out so I can do what I have to do today and then have an old man nap somewhere. Okay. So there were some stabbings over the weekend in Ilford, and obviously people have made all sorts of assumptions about that before proper information came out. Now that the proper information has come out, it seems that it's 3 men who were killed, and 2 groups were fighting each other, and all supposedly knew each other. And it's groups from the Sikh community, not the Muslim community. There's been no formal identification, but that's what they've said so far. So it doesn't seem to be a terrorism-related stabbing, which a lot of people have been saying, nor particularly a recent immigrant community stabbing, which a lot of other people are claiming as well. This seems to have come or been within the Sikh community, who, while they have a strong martial tradition, don't tend to be that violent. So this seems to be an exception rather than the rule, and if you're using it to bolster your anti-Muslim sentiment or your anti-immigration sentiment, then you're being a bit of a dick. So there's that. Information, always wait for it. Sticking on the kind of prejudice bandwagon thing at the moment, the whole Harry and Meghan thing seems to have stirred up a lot of self-flagellation and so on. I still contend that this is mostly to do with class. He married out and he married down, and there you go. And it was a bit of a media grabber because she was like a C-list actor or actress, if you want to go with the old terminology, you know. So it was kind of obvious that there was going to be an issue there, even without bringing any sort of racial animus into it. And I think it's incorrect to lay the full blame at race. Of course, there are racists involved, because there always are, really. But I don't think that's where the real sort of blame needs to be laid here. Racists are just kind of bandwagoning on what was there, and we're always will be fringe voices for the most part. Some of the tabloid stuff sails a little close, particularly the Daily Mail, but they always do. So, yeah, but that's not what this is actually about, that specific thing. Though there have been developments in the story. Basically, the Queen said, all right then, sort of. Fair enough, I guess. But there's this study up on the BBC that people born in Britain to migrant parents are more likely to feel discriminated against than migrants who are new to the UK. Okay, that's weird, but it's also about how people feel, not what necessarily is actually happening. So there's two surveys from 2018. Amongst new immigrants, over 70% say that Britain is welcoming, and 90% believe that migrants can make it here in the UK if they work hard. This is immigrants as a whole, I think. Amongst non-EU migrants, it's not quite as good. So if you only stick to non-EU migrants, they're a little bit less keen. But for second-generation migrants, the feeling of being discriminated against rises to 30%. But this is a feeling. It's not necessarily a fact. I'm not sure how you would actually measure prejudice and discrimination objectively, and I think that's a big part of the problem that plagues a lot of these kind of studies and these kind of arenas of research. Plus, they tend to be conducted by activists who have a preconception when they go in. I'm not seeking to dismiss claims of racism and so on. I'm just saying, you need to enter a note of caution. So what little objective data we do have would seem to suggest that it's first-generation migrants who have the biggest problems. So the objective issues, more of them are in poverty, and so on and so on and so on and so on. They're the ones that have a harder time of it. So why would second and third generation children of immigrants feel more discriminated against? And I wonder if that is down to being told that they're being discriminated against a lot. We shouldn't dismiss this. There's plenty of instances where we can see that telling people that what they're doing is bad, or telling people that they're having a hard time, or telling people that they're being discriminated against creates the feeling of discrimination or marginalization or trouble or trauma where it doesn't necessarily objectively exist. Right? So my sort of touchstone for this kind of similar sort of psychological effect is abortion. One of the arguments to get against abortion that a lot of Americans bring up is that the terrible psychological toll that it takes on the mother. And they point to various statistics on this in studies in the US that would seem to support that contention. But if you look at countries where abortion is very much accepted, normalized, understood, not seen as particularly controversial amongst the majority of people in the populace, you don't have those psychological issues. You don't have that post-abortion depression or regret or whatever, which would seem to suggest that the environment in the US, where this is much more of a contentious issue, where there's lots of protests, where it's condemned out of hand constantly and all the time, that is what creates the psychological toll. So if you tell people they're being discriminated against, that the country is rife with racism, blah, 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 you may in fact be creating that sensation and feeling and aggravation in people who may not necessarily be being discriminated against. Just as with abortion, you can create this feeling that you've done something terrible when they haven't. It's just that social censure, that opprobrium from the people around you. That may be where the problem is coming from. The act of discrimination, the act of creating an atmosphere which people think they're discriminated against, or they think they've done something terrible where they haven't necessarily. But this feeling of discrimination and so on is on the rise amongst EU citizens, and there I think there is, we can say that there is an objective basis for that, based on the uptick in reports specifically around EU people and the lack of surety about their legal status and so on once Brexit's done at the end of this month. Well, no, Brexit won't be done once we enter that transition period at the end of this month, it's so I think there's objective reasons for that, and that would explain the rise there. But otherwise, I don't know. It's just nobody seems to contextualize these studies or consider the psychological effect of telling people constantly that the place they're living is a horrible racist shithole and that they're discriminated against constantly, whether they are or not. And I think that needs to be an area of study. I've been keeping a weather eye on the new virus in China. It's not SARS. It's a coronavirus apparently now, and more concerning is that cases are being reported in Beijing and in Shenzhen now. Shenzhen's a tech hub, borders Hong Kong, which remains a very strong international city. Beijing's capital, obviously, so this increases the risk of it travelling to other countries and so on. So far, it's still only about 200 cases, and when you consider the population of China, that's nothing too huge to worry about. And we're still well below SARS, which caused a panic, but only killed about 500 to 800 people, if I remember correctly. Split the difference, 700 people. So it's not a huge worry yet, but this is a period of travel in China. This is why it's spreading around in China, and now it's got an increased risk of passing on to other people. Several cases have been confirmed abroad now, only about 4, but everyone seems to be on it and concerned and worried and doing what they can, so I wouldn't be too concerned yet. And there haven't been a lot of deaths or anything. It's not huge yet, but it's still just worth keeping an eye on. And sooner or later, we are going to have a big problem with one disease or another. It's just this doesn't seem to be it. Why is that still saying top chat and not live chat? Let's fix that. There we go. Right, fires are continuing in Australia, obviously, but storms have come in. There has been rain, which has been helpful. There has been wind, which is not as helpful. There has been really heavy hail, which has been heavy enough to crush cars. Some of this will be in part caused by the fires and the huge amount of smoke going up. That creates its own microclimates and its own weather systems and so on. The heat being poured into the atmosphere, smoke particles, and so on. So it's welcome, but it's not enough, and the fires are continuing, and the storms are, if anything, adding to the problems. There's been a lot of disinformation around about what's caused the fires, with a lot of people abroad trying to say, it's not climate change, it's just a drought and these happen, and arson and so on. Arson is not a major cause of this. The big cause was lightning strikes, which is another reason to think that these storms aren't necessarily a good thing, or at least only a mixed blessing. And droughts happen, hot weather happens. This is what nobody seems to understand about climate change. The things that are going to happen, drought and storms and polar vortices and so on, they're all things we have seen before, but they're going to be more extreme and they're going to be more common, and that's going to be how climate change primarily manifests itself to start with. So we have a particularly long drought and particularly harsh bushfires. And it's not down to environmentalists banning controlled burns or anything. It's more to do with the government. Environmentalists have been campaigning for that and Aboriginal land management for some time. So it's not that either. People making excuses. So that's how you have to understand it in context. It's more energy in the system means harsher, harder, nastier weather. And frankly, if Australia can't get its act together, can't boot out this government or whenever their next election cycle is, and get in some more environmentalists and frankly some more collectivists, because we're all in this together. If Australia can't sort its act out and tackle climate issues as a nation, as a country, individually, without whining about China or India or something, then there's no hope for the rest of us at this point. I think with what has happened, Australia really needs to wake up, and I'm a little concerned that they won't. As ever, the problem is that the shitheads are united, and the people who want progress and positive change and to make things better tend to be divided. Speaking of, so there's controversies going on across Virginia because they elected a left-wing for America sort of state government, and they're wanting to bring in some very modest gun restrictions and laws, and a lot of gun nuts are up in arms. Now, I think America should effectively ban guns, except for maybe limited ammunition, shotguns and rifles for hunting. Personal firearms, people carrying them around all the time, having them in their homes, it does more harm than good. That might not be particularly comforting when you get a home invasion, but statistically you're far more likely to shoot yourself, have an accident, have someone in your family shoot themselves or someone else in your family. You're far more likely to be in that situation, harmed by your own weapon, than you are to successfully use it in home defense. And in most home defense instances, it just ups the ante and increases your odds of being shot. But I don't think America is capable of doing the obvious, sensible thing because of this fetishization of the Constitution and misinterpretation of the Constitution. The idea that it ever meant wholesale gun ownership for everyone just doesn't match up with the text at all. There's some really twisted interpretations, not unlike the kind of twisted interpretations we see of the Bible, or the literalist interpretations we see of the Bible. But you won't be able to do a ban. I think the only way to really do anything in the States is to try and tackle the culture first, and to do very slow, very incremental gun control. But if even these very, very light attempts to tamp down a little bit on gun laws lead to these kind of mass rallies and protests, the far right's got involved, and the far left, the more sort of revolutionary Marxists and the like, the more militant wing of Black Bloc and Antifa have all got involved as well. This is really modest stuff that really doesn't mean very much, and yet it sparked essentially civil unrest in Virginia, and people declaring, Second Amendment sanctuary cities and so on. But if you can't pass even the slightest controls, then what is there left to do? Surely even basic common sense stuff like mentally ill people shouldn't be given free access to firearms. That if you can't get that through, what hope have you got? And if they have these constant massacres, these constant mass shootings, and still nobody cares because of this fetishization and because of this weird belief that somehow a good guy with a gun makes all the difference. They'll leap on those few individual cases where it has made a positive difference and ignore the swathe of cases where it makes it worse. I don't know what the solution is for the States, but maybe it starts with changing the culture. How do you do that? I don't know. I don't know either. You can look at other nations where gun ownership is fairly ubiquitous that don't have the same problem, and they tend to be places that are far more rural even than the States, where a gun is a tool for hunting and warding off animals and that sort of thing. Or they're countries where they have it's like civilian service, so everyone does a certain amount of military training or paramedic training or civilian service training, whatever. You've got that going on. Everyone does a little bit of service. So like Israel or Finland or Norway, places like that, where basically they've militarized their entire population due to history, and in case they ever get into a big knockdown drag out fight like World War II again, everyone has access to a rifle. But also everyone goes through training, right? And there are very strict rules about how you contain your firearm, how much ammunition you can carry, all the rest of it. But everyone is put through military training, drilled on safety and how to use the firearm correctly, how to take care of it correctly, how important it is to keep it away. So if you take the militia part of the Constitution seriously, well, technically that's the National Guard. It never meant everybody. But if you take that seriously, then maybe that's a path to changing the culture, saying it's for militias. So if you want a firearm, you must attend this safety course, this training course, that kind of thing, and you must submit yourself to being called up in times of emergency. Maybe that would be a way to shift the culture. And you would think maybe gun nuts would be quite happy to get some professional training from the military or something. So maybe that's a path to change. Would that be as positive in the States? I don't know, but it might be. The price of palladium is going up massively, and this is due to a negative feedback loop, which is a phenomenon that's behind a lot of what you see in the news, like violence, like the sensation of prejudice, like climate change. So we don't produce enough palladium for our needs, largely because palladium is used in catalytic converters, right? And there's a big demand for catalytic converters, and it's a bigger demand than there is supply of palladium, which is used as a catalyst. Synchronicity. I was trying to remember the word catalyst yesterday and couldn't. So, price of palladium skyrocketed because of the demand from catalytic converters, and thieves are now stealing catalytic converters because palladium is in it and it's so pricey. So if you steal a catalytic converter, then the palladium and the other materials in it are worth, relatively speaking, a lot of money, which further removes supply, which means the price goes up, which encourages theft, which means the price goes up, which encourages theft, which means the price goes up. Yeah, so palladium's now about it's nearly £2,000 an ounce, which makes it more expensive than gold. And we still don't have a big enough supply, and catalytic converters are still being stolen. So there you go. There's a whole bunch of other factors as well, like diesel was really popular for a while, right, because it was considered to be cleaner than petrol. That turned out to be fake due to a scandal. Various car manufacturers were twitching the figures. So petrol cars have risen in popularity again after that, and so demand for catalytic converters has gone up, and so it all spirals. Yeah. Oh, and the US-China trade deal that was just signed has also bumped that up. I'll answer comments and things at the end if you've got any questions or comments or stories I've missed or whatever. Just pop something in the comments and I'll get to that at the end. Speaking of the US-China trade deal, there's this analyses of Trump's trading strategies on various sites and newspapers and so on lately because this US-China deal was done, and discussing the efficacy of his attempts to use tariffs. So one set of analysis judges that the cost of the tariffs that the US placed on China, over 90% fell on the US consumer and producer and had substantially zero effect upon China. So this deal that he's trumpeting and is saying the best deal ever is more a US surrender to the self-harm it was causing than anything else. I mean, it's still a good thing, but it's not that good because a whole bunch of tariffs of like 25%, I think, are still going to be levied against a whole bunch of goods from China. And China's still going to keep a bunch of tariffs on US imports. So if you want to see how it's still biased, right? So Trump's charging about 25% on $360 billion worth of Chinese goods, and China's keeping its tariffs on about $100 billion of US imports. So you can see immediately how that's going to hurt America more, like 3 to 4 times as much, and it's self-imposed. And this seems to be pretty much the model elsewhere around the world. These tariffs, these tactics, these bully boy tactics seem to be harming the US far more than they seem to be harming anybody else that they're levied against. And Trump has also threatened to impose tariffs on the UK when we're supposed to be negotiating a trade deal, because he didn't feel that our support of his extra-legal assassination of an Iranian general was such a good idea. And so he was threatening tariffs against the UK to try and get them to back what he was doing. The man's an idiot and a bully. People rag on socialists for not understanding economics. Trump doesn't understand economics. He just understands getting his own way, at whatever cost. Like his tax breaks. They've blown an enormous hole in the US budget, and whoever gets in next is going to have to deal with it. Well, Trump won't. He'll probably entrench it for another 4 years, but what can you do? What can you do? Well, they've impeached him, but for the wrong reasons, so that might not work. Where's an assassin when you need him? Why do they only kill the good ones? Except for, points for trying with Reagan, but the laws are changing in the UK around stalking, so court orders will be able to stop suspected but unconfirmed stalkers who are under police investigation to prevent them contacting their victims, which sounds like a good thing, but we know that there are false accusations, we just don't know how many, and this will lead to someone being punished before any assessment has been made as to whether they've actually committed a crime or that they are stalking or anything. So this will create stigma. It may well create punishments for people who haven't done anything wrong. No one seems to think about that side of things, the danger and the difficulty of false accusations, particularly when just an accusation can lead to enforcement. Now, we already know that a simple accusation can completely ruin and cancel someone due to the nature of social media and that sort of hype and witch hunting that goes on. But this is an actual official sanction on the basis of an accusation. Now, some accusations, I think there's a definite argument to be made that you should do something. Like if someone's accused of being a paedophile, you want to make sure that they don't abuse any other children or whatever in that time. Stalking can escalate, but it's more of a nuisance. So I'm hoping they're a bit careful about applying this, and they only do it in cases where the accusations are genuinely and really and deeply serious. I'm just not keen on punishing people without any sort of genuine confirmation that they've actually done anything wrong, right? Nuance. Nobody gets it. There's a minor fuss about an MP, a Conservative, so I'm not particularly keen on defending them, who ended up sharing an office with a sugar daddy website. Look, when you're running a campaign, you don't really have a lot of choice about the places you hire. You go for the cheapest available. So if you end up sharing office or sharing workspace with dodgy sites, it's really nothing to do with you, and I don't think he should be accused or attacked for this. It basically means nothing. I think I hear a delivery. I will be right back. Here's some adverts in the meantime. Be right back. A problem for every games master has always been coming up with adventure ideas. For years now, Postmortem Studios has been helping out with the 100 Adventure Seeds line. These provide adventure ideas for all genres, and you can get them at RPG Now or Lulu.com. At the end of World War II, the Axis and the Allies went to war with A-bombs until nobody was left to fight. In this atomic wasteland, a new breed of rockabilly hero arises. From the gleaming domes of Science City Zero to the sleazy roller derbies of Vegas and the sky fortress of the Fourth Reich, there's a new world for the taking. 45 Psychobilly Retropocalypse, available at Lulu.com and RPG Now.
Aren't you a little tired of so-called horror media about shiny, sparkly, angsty, whiny monsters? I know I am, and that's why I created actual fucking monsters, where you will play an actual fucking monster doing horrible and monstrous things and being tracked down and killed for it. Buy now at DriveThruRPG, post-mort.com or lulu.com.
The Atomic Age, with its A-bombs, transistorized radios, jet engines, and a new breed of dangerous supervillain, requires heroes to face the challenge. That's where you come in. The world needs you, Agent of Swing.
"Rrrr," said the grinder as it chewed its way through Alice, from the crown of her head all the way down to her toes. It ate the lot of her, unfussy, snout to tail, and cleared its plate. It gnashed its way through her dress, her pinafore, her shoes, and her unmentionables. It chewed her hair, devoured her scalp, gobbled up her arms, wolfed down her legs, gorged itself on her torso, noshed on her skin, and gulped her down without so much as a burp to show for it.
Do you like t-shirts?
Yeah, boy!
Do you like games?
Certainly.
Are you perhaps a little bit kinky?
Yes, quite.
Then buy one of our B&D t-shirts at Teespring. Teespring.com/stores/postmortem-studios. You want to be cool, don't you?
Does the word duh mean anything to you?
Sure, you could play one of those hoity-toity horror games where the most horrifying thing that happens is someone wearing a corset who really shouldn't. Or you could grind a zombie's face into a belt sander.
Postmortem Studios sells a wide variety of stock art, well over 500 pieces, many of them by RPG industry veteran Brad McDevitt. These are available for you to use in your personal or professional projects, whether stories or games or anything else. Check us out at rpgnow.com.
In his house in Relier, great Cthulhu lies dreaming, and when he awakens, he shall have the morning wood of aeons. Call of Cthulhu is a deeply pornographic card game. Enjoy your tentacles.
Tal, friend, and welcome to Gore. Savage and beautiful, John Norman's Gorean saga is brought to life in the Tales of Gore role-playing game and its companion world book, World of Gore. Take flight on a tarn, luxuriate in the bathhouses of Ar, pit your steel against the deadly curry, best your enemies and place them in your collar. Tales of Gore uses the D6 system, perfect for both new and old players. You can purchase it from Amazon, RPG Now, or Lulu.com. Ta Sada Gore. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. Sorry about that. New year, so a lot of ordering of new stuff, and then they always seem to choose to deliver early, which is good, but when I'm streaming, which is bad. Right, where were we? Okay. Yes. Brexit. So the car industry's dead, that's been the big news. But the other big news is that the Chancellor put his foot in it and said basically we're not going to converge with EU rules on a lot of things. Now that's a kind of warning that maybe we are going to do this dodgy food deal with the US, but it also means that food prices are likely going to rise, jobs might be affected. So we're not going to align with EU rules. So, I mean, it sounds bombastic and everything. This is Sajid Javid, of course, who actually campaigned against Brexit in the past, but now seems to have gone full bore. So basically, we'll no longer be in regulatory alignment with the EU, and that creates all kinds of problems for import and export. It creates extra expenses because companies will have to work to two different sets of rules and so on. It's the end of frictionless trade with the EU, which means a lot of manufacturing is affected. Not that we have a lot of manufacturing. and a whole bunch of other problems, and particularly the service economy as well, which is the most of our economy these days. Some businesses might benefit in a small way. A lot of businesses are going to be fucked, as we all said. So I'm going to use one of my stockpile of I told you so. It's there to explain why it's shit. If governments are dragging their heels, some companies, weirdly, are not when it comes to climate issues. Microsoft is aiming to go completely carbon neutral and to counteract every bit of carbon they're estimated to have produced during the lifetime of the company by 2030. This is an ambitious goal, but not as ambitious as it could have been. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of these big companies like Microsoft, they have been sons of bitches in the past. I mean, Microsoft, the whole thing was built on stolen software, right? DOS from back in the day, from IBM. I don't know how much influence you-know-who still has over Microsoft, but he's certainly gotten into his philanthropy, sort of vaccinations, particularly issues around malaria and so on since. So I guess it's not completely out of keeping with Microsoft, the new image and so on, but then they're not the company they used to be. What we really need or hope for is that this will encourage other tech companies to do the same thing. But yeah, Microsoft is not the tech leader that it once was. So it'll be interesting to see if anyone else follows suit or tries to outdo them or whatever. And maybe we can make that work. I don't think private enterprise is the way to work, because too many of these private enterprises depend upon massive carbon footprints and the expulsion of huge amounts of carbon, particularly when it comes to energy industries, petrol, coal, all the rest of it. And there isn't a way that they can really hope to do the same sort of thing. So you need governments to step in and do that, and it's the governments that are being corrupted by the money invested in lobbying and so on by the fossil fuel industry, for example. There are others. I mean, it's welcome. You don't want to put anyone off doing it, and I hope other tech companies will follow suit, or that Microsoft can maybe leverage this in some way. But as it stands, I'm not too hopeful for a private solution to this problem. Private research might find techniques that work for geoengineering and so on, but it has to happen at the state level, at the international level, and it isn't. Privacy, facial recognition technology. The Chinese are already using it. Various other governments are already exploring it. The UK police force has been trialling it in some areas. But the EU, which we're leaving, of course, is considering a ban on facial recognition technology within the EU for up to 5 years. Now, the positive side of facial recognition tech is that you could spot terrorists as they are about to do something. It can spot people even through certain kinds of disguises and so on. The downside is that it may be used to target protesters, petty criminals that aren't really worth the time, to invade your privacy if private companies start using facial recognition software to tell exactly who you are, where you've been, what you've done, what shops you've been into, like they kind of already do with your GPS data from your mobile and everything, but worse. All this data, all this invasion of privacy, it can be used for good things, right? It's not necessarily evil in and of itself, but the trouble with technology is that someone will always use it for bad reasons. So it's a concern, and the EU wants to make sure that they have legislation in place, or ideas at least in place, to prevent this being abused. Like maybe limit when it can be used, what it can be used for, that sort of thing. So they've declared a moratorium on it. And it's not just facial recognition anymore that you need to be worried about. This software will soon be able to read our emotions, recognize us not just by our face but by our pace, the way we walk, all of that sort of thing. You know, it's all technology is a tool. It's not necessarily bad or wrong in and of itself. It's how people use it that's the potential problem. Like that video I did on my main channel a little while back, last week, about exowombs. You know, these could be massively liberating things because it frees women from the tyranny of biology and having to do childbirth directly in their own bodies and so on, and necessarily being the primary caregiver and all the rest of it. But then there's also more sinister implications of that technology and unpredictable implications. Like, we didn't know the far-reaching social effects the contraceptive pill would have. Overall, I think it's been a great and a good thing, but we couldn't predict how it would affect the sexual revolution and our entire societies, and yet it did. And an exowomb would be at least as disruptive a technology as the pill. So this locally relevant news. So I live in a nice chocolate boxy little village in the English countryside, in Hampshire, in the south of the UK. Very green, very pleasant. Chalk downs around here for the most part. Lots of rare butterfly breeds, that sort of thing. And nature has largely been making a bit of a comeback in recent years. Never used to see predatory birds at all, but barely a day goes by where you step outside and you don't see, or at least hear, a red kite. And I've seen other predatory birds, buzzards. It's a different kind of bird than you're thinking if you're American. In the UK, I've seen a small falcon. I'm not entirely sure which species it was, but a fairly dinky one. And if you see the predatory birds and if they seem to be doing well, then you know the food chain all the way down is doing pretty well. I don't know what the change has been, but nature's really bounced back around here. Anyway, there's some woods. There's a copse, some fairly ancient managed woodland up on the hill, behind my house, behind the recreation ground, and it's been much beloved. Used to play there all the time as a kid, and it was nicely overgrown and lovely. But a lot of the trees there were ash, and we do have a problem in the UK at the moment with an ash dieback disease, which attacks these plants. And the people who own the land, because it's a private woodland, elected to cut down a whole bunch of the trees, which is kind of what you're supposed to do, but kind of not. So what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to have the ash trees genetically tested for resistance to ash dieback disease, and if the tree is resistant, you're supposed to leave it. And you're even supposed to allow trees to live to see if they develop resistance. They didn't. They cut everything back, and they've absolutely devastated the woodland. They blocked a bunch of badger sets, which is illegal. They did a lot of the cutting down during bird nesting season, which was illegal, but there's been absolutely no blowback on the people that did it. And it's just absolutely disgusting. And now there's planting across the county of resistant strains of ash. So I kind of hope some of it gets planted back up in our woods when there's a lot of reforestation going on. But if they'd done what they were supposed to and gene tested the trees and only cut down the ones that were vulnerable, we'd be in a much better situation here in the village. But yeah, as a result of what they've irresponsibly done to our woodland, I'm kind of invested in this issue now. And I'm slowly paying for trees to be planted around the world to offset my lifetime carbon in much the same way that Microsoft is. So I would recommend that. You can get $1 a tree from some charities, and you don't have to buy the tree in your local area, or it can be anywhere around the world. We all share an atmosphere, and I need to spend about $1,500 in total to offset my carbon footprint for my lifetime and to counteract any of my future carbon output. Now, I'm a low carbon guy, so you might need to spend $2,000 over the rest of your life in tree planting to compensate, but something to consider. Plus, it's just good for the environment anyway. Language. I'm a writer. Language is one of my personal bugbears. I really, really resent attempts to impose certain forms of language. So I find a lot of woke language, politically correct language, to be sort of 1984 style newspeak, and I really, really don't like the way that they try and force it. At the same time, language changes naturally over time. And one good example of this is the use of they, the singular they. Yeah, using it as a gender-neutral pronoun. They, to me, is acceptable compared to a lot of these made-up ones, right? And that's because it's an organic change. It's something that has just happened over time. Never mind that, according to etymology, the male gender pronoun is the neutral one. There isn't actually a male gender pronoun in English. There used to be. There isn't anymore. There's only a female one. But there you go. But that's an example of an organic linguistic change. And I'm fascinated by slang. I find it very creative, and I find that to be another example of the organic change in language. But predictably, since we have a conservative government, they like to interfere in education in a rather authoritarian way, and so there's an attempt to try and sort of ban slang terms from being used in the classroom and in classroom discussions, and to try and impose a kind of centralized BBC English sort of vocabulary, and I think that's a huge shame. Because English as a language has nicked words from all around the world. Our slang is incredibly creative and amazing. Even when it's not being used in Britain, it's amazing. Like, if you're watching The Last Leg, there's an Australian phrase, apparently. Well, we're not here to fuck spiders. That's fantastic. So I don't think bringing in rules against the use of slang makes sense. I'm far more concerned about imposed language than I am about natural language. And schools already do so much to quash people's creative impulses and to stamp out their enthusiasm for English, for language, for art as well, by trying to impose what you can and can't do, what counts as proper and improper. This seems to me to be going entirely the opposite way to where we should be doing. We should be embracing slang and organic change of language, but then you can do exercises where, okay, we want you to write this or to discuss this topic in the form that the BBC might do it. Yeah, make that an exercise, and allow kids to be creative and expressive in their language, because that is the beauty of English. It can be mangled out of virtually all recognition and still be understood. Pidgin English can be understood. English is a really complicated and difficult language to learn, but I think one of its chief advantages, besides the ubiquity of American and British and Australian and Canadian entertainment around the world, I think one of its chief strengths is its sheer creativity and the fact that you can fuck it up and still be understood, and that's an amazing thing. So yeah, I'm against it. Sex education is always really controversial, right? Shouldn't be, and I think people should be educated on sex, what sex is, sexual negotiation, consent, all of those things from quite early on, right? And I think it's better that kids know about this stuff as early as possible so they don't get exploited. And in tech news, what's happening is a lot of preteen and teen kids are being exploited or tricked into performing sex acts and sort of sending naked selfies and things to people who are predatory. And a lot of this seems to me to be driven by the fact that sex education is so fucking terrible because adults are so squeamish about it, at least in Britain and the US and a few other places. Far too squeamish to have frank and open conversations with kids about it, or to have proper sex ed classes in schools, because they think that will encourage sexual behaviour in some cases. But in countries that do have far more liberal and far more informative sex education, the opposite happens. We see less preteen sex, we see less teen pregnancy and that sort of thing. And if we did educate kids fairly young about this sort of thing, I think it would be a lot harder to trick them or get them to enter into this kind of early sexually explorative misbehaviour, right? If they really understood the dangers of predators and what was going on. So it's easy to whip up a moral panic about this sort of thing, and it's easy for the wrong message to be taken, and it's very easy to bring in laws and things that make no sense that end up punishing the people who are being potentially exploited, right? So if you're a kid, legally, 15-year-old, and you send a naked selfie to your boyfriend or your girlfriend or whatever, under the law, you're considered to have trafficked in child pornography, and you can go on the sex offenders list, and that can be your life fucked, even if both of you consent and so on. The law is a blunt instrument, and this kind of thing needs nuance, and we need proper sex education. But nobody listens to me. Excuse me. Hank Azaria is no longer going to voice Apu. Now, that may be a very roundabout way of confirming that The Simpsons is finally coming to an end, which has been rumoured for a while now. So if he's stepping down from voicing Apu, that may just be a consequence of the fact that The Simpsons might finally be ending. I don't know whether it's remotely as popular as it ever was. Apu is an interesting test case in just how rapidly culture can change and shift and move, and how regressive a lot of people who consider themselves woke can be. Now, Apu started out as a stereotype, the corner shop owning immigrant Indian. But like so many stereotypes, there is a grain of truth to that. A lot of convenience stores and so on are run by immigrants and ethnic minorities and so on. And Apu was an incarnation of that. I mean, I remember when I went to secondary school, the corner shop at the end of the road that led up to the secondary school, high school for Yanks, was run by an Indian who didn't speak English at all. So if you wanted something, you had to give him the number of the thing, and he knew his numbers, and that was it. So whenever you went in, it was just, what number, please? And that was it. So people like Apu are real, genuine people. It's a stereotype that marries up to reality. I don't think Apu has ever been represented in a negative light, and in fact he's become a far more sympathetic and well-rounded character over time. His veganism, his Hinduism, his desperation to fit in and make his way, his hard work, his big family, all of it. Everyone knows The Simpsons, even if they don't watch it, right? He's become this really well-rounded character that a lot of South Asian people I know think he's brilliant and don't particularly care who voices him. Particularly as he's developed over time. Sort of hard-working to the point of exhaustion sort of guy. He's admirable in a lot of ways. But he's only just recently become considered problematic. I don't think it's a good thing to force a change or to force his removal or whatever else they decide to do to deal with him. I think he's been dealt with much more sensitively in recent years, and I think he's a good character that is a good thing for Indian Americans. If they do get someone else to voice him, I guess that could work. It still feels wrong, but if they can keep the character and deal with the criticism by having someone else voice him, but I think we all know that wouldn't end the criticism, would it? Even if they get an Indian actor to voice him, right? There's still going to be opprobrium, and they'll be accused of acting white or perpetuating racism or internalized racism or something. You just know that's how it's going to go. You just know it's obvious. Right, let's see what people have been saying. Adam says, I worry about what diseases are going to be freed by melting ice. We've already had anthrax reappear somewhere briefly. Yeah, and there was that Russian scientist who I've talked about who identified some new bugs that were released from the permafrost in Siberia and injected himself with them. Fortunately to no ill effect, but you want a zombie plague? That's how you get a zombie plague. But yeah, that's another huge concern with climate change, the melting permafrost. I mean, not only is it releasing massive amounts of stored carbon and methane, which are both greenhouse gases, as it melts, and we better hope the methane hydrates never go, but all these frozen enspored pathogens, viruses, bacteria, single-cell organisms, parasites, and so on, are all potentially surviving in this permafrost and being released. And as the ice retreats, this land becomes more settleable, more explorable in a lot of cases, which means humanity expands to fill that gap and to exploit that land and those resources, and so exposes themselves to it. So yeah, that's a big issue. Population booms in areas that have until now been relatively wild is another issue, because pathogens can travel from animals to people and then wreak havoc in the human population when they don't necessarily in the animal population. AIDS is perhaps the most well-known of those. And then just the sheer scale of population crammed into small areas also allows for enormous amounts of transmission and mutation of pathogens, which is what we're seeing in China. So yeah, lots of things to worry about. Adam also says, we had one school shooting, Dunblane, we banned guns, and we never had another. America seems to have one or two each week. Does anything more need to be said? We did have that mass stabbing. Where was that? That was pretty terrible. That guy walked into a school and macheted a teacher and a bunch of kids. That was horrible. I think the knife bans are a bit stupid. But yeah, Dunblane wasn't that far from here. It was... no, Dunblane was. Hungerford was the one I was thinking of. Hungerford wasn't that far from here. It's just down the way a bit. That was when we really clamped down, and then I think Dunblane was after, and that's when it became full on. And yeah, we've never had the problem again. At least certainly not to that extent. But they can't seem to do it. I mean, part of that's the size of the US and the patchwork nature of the US. So a lot of people in the US say, well, they banned guns in this area, but it didn't stop someone coming in and shooting a bunch of people up. Well, that's because it's no good if you do it piecemeal. If you live in one state or one city that has really harsh gun laws, but you live next to another city or another state that has really lax gun laws, it's really easy for someone to just come from one place to the other with the guns that they legally own or more easily get access to in one state and shoot the fuck out of your state where you've made the right decisions. And then they use that as this reason to crow that gun control doesn't work. Oh, this was a gun-free zone and someone with a gun walked into it. Well, yeah, patchwork solutions don't work, but they're better than nothing. But you need to do something at the federal level, at the national level about this. But there's not the will, there's not the understanding, and there's too many powerful interests perpetuating the gun fetishism. And honestly, I don't think they could ban guns. I think it needs to be done incrementally, very slowly, innovative solutions, things like the training that I talked about. None of Your Business says, In Austria, we have military service. You can choose to do social service, hospitals, etc. instead. If you do, however, you can't buy a gun for some amount of years. Yeah, that's a lot of smaller European nations do that. Yeah, and we used to have national service. I wouldn't want to bring that back. But having the option of doing civilian service or getting civilian training in first aid or fire service or something like that as an option if you don't want to do the military training seems like a good idea to me. And I do think that the discipline and the understanding that comes from that kind of service changes the culture. And I think that's why you don't see the same problems in a lot of otherwise heavily armed, relatively speaking, European nations like Switzerland, Finland, or wherever. That I think that's a huge part of why you don't see that problem, is that there is that training, that discipline. They're actually creating militias and they are regulating them, which is what America's supposed to do, but has somehow bizarrely interpreted to mean anyone and everyone can have a gun. And it's just very weird. Adam says, any thoughts on the new Trek Picard? Not seen it yet, so I don't. Is it out yet? I don't think it is out yet. I'm cautiously optimistic because I think he's a fantastic actor, and I think whatever he's given, he'll do something good with. So I'll watch it just for Patrick Stewart. And even if it's shit and doesn't match up to canon and anything, then I don't care. I really rate Patrick Stewart as a bloke, anyway, and as an actor. I still think it's an enormous shame that his role was cut down so much in Dune, the old film. So we've got that series to look forward to, and I kind of hope he's been invited to do like a guest thing on the new Dune series. Because he was playing Gurney Halleck, and his part was just cut to shreds, and it was a huge shame. Danny Business says, thinking about how we don't protect the environment is a good way of getting depressed. It is, but I've kind of decided that I'm going to do what I can to make a difference, and I've found that has lifted some of the gloom. Yes, the 1980s Dune film. Nani Business says, I'm not scared of facial recognition or AI, I'm scared of the people using it. Yeah, it's like the whole big data issue. All this information is out there about us, what we eat, where we go, all the rest of it. Huge amounts of data are held by health services and so on. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, and it can be used in really good ways, like innovative ways. Like you can process that data and find all kinds of amazing things out from it. But the kind of people that are currently exploiting that data and what they can extract from it are people trying to sell you things or to sway your political opinion and so on. There's nothing necessarily wrong with the tool. It's who's using it and what they're using it for. Adam says we seem to be competing with China on this stuff. They lead the field in this, and their social credit system is horrifyingly dystopian. We don't have that, but we kind of don't need it because people are already doing that to each other. Digging up ancient tweets where someone says something impolitic and trying to get them fired over it or whatever else. So we kind of have it and we don't. Technologically speaking, we've got a lot of companies and so on trying to revise and hone that technology, and in large part to sell it to the Chinese and other authoritarian regimes. Yeah. None of your business says, specialised slang is highly interesting to me too. It's fascinating that two chemists talk basically a different language, as do hobby groups such as gamers. It's so interesting. Yes, I agree 100%. But it does cause problems when you're trying to cross-communicate. So that's why I quite often take the time to define what I mean by terms when I say them. And I think it's a huge part of the reason why the woke mob anger so many people. It's like when I say racism, I mean prejudice on the basis of race. When a lot of them say racism, they mean institutional racism, something like apartheid or segregation in 1950s America, things like that. So there's a lack of communication there. Or when you're trying to discuss atheism or evolution or science with creationists, and you say theory, they hear guess, which isn't the scientific meaning of theory. So you need to take the time to establish the definition of the terms that you're using, and it takes time, and it makes it hard to communicate. Like when people talk about privilege, that's another example. They mean something that isn't the popular understanding of privilege when they say privilege, and it's more effort needs to be made to communicate. And that's why I think that, particularly in the science community, science communicators, right, are really looked down on by the scientific community when they shouldn't be, because it's all very well making these fantastic discoveries, but you need to convey them to people. And it's quite rare that you get a Sagan or a Dawkins who's capable of transmitting that new information to people in a manner that excites and interests them and that they can understand, Adam says, the 1980s Dune film. Yes, I actually rate that film. A lot of people don't, but I really liked it. But yeah, he's in that. Just remember being frightened at age 11 by someone flying up to a light and having their face explode. Well, yeah, that would do it. Ever read Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom? No, I haven't read that. Oh, have I? I think I've read one of them. I don't remember it very well. Brian Cox and Neil deGrasse Tyson seem to be giving it a good go on the science communication. Yeah, they're both pretty good at it as well. Cox because he makes ladies' panties wet, and Tyson's a bit of a pedant, but he is still a good science communicator. I guess he's the closest thing to a new Sagan, but he's a little bit less philosophical. None Business says, the problem with communication is even a thing amongst scientists today. Everything's so specialised outside of our very special field. You have no idea what they do. Yeah, that's what's holding us back. I think the internet compensated for that for a while, but you really don't have the same number of Renaissance men who are good at several things, or people who have a kind of scattershot interest and can create those kind of synergistic combinations. It will probably be a good idea to have like cross-discipline meetings facilitated by science communicators, so that hyper-specialist people can start to see how their studies could cross-pollinate to others. Anyway, I gotta go. See you later.